My wife and I lived in England from 2003 to 2005. That time for us was a blessed time. Many dear friends that we still call friends. Our first daughter was born there. I would say in the cluster of pivotal experiences, that was fairly central and as a contributor to our eventual conversion into the Catholic Church. When you drive through England or walk through across the rights of way, you'll see walls here and there, fencing off different areas. No mortar that was used in the building of these walls. It's amazing. And they've stood for centuries. They're an art form, you could say, that passes from father to son, kind of falling out of that tradition. But anyway, they're quite something to see. And they give shape and story to a culture for a long duration of time. And I'd like you to keep this idea in mind throughout my following developments in this first session. It'll be a kind of subtext that runs throughout the observations to come. The title of this first session comes from Isaiah 49, 6-7 as a text there. I'll read it for you. It's not in your notes. It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, says a divine voice to some unspecified character in this prophetic book of Isaiah. It's too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach beyond my covenant people, to the ends of the earth. So, coming to the first heading in your handout, the first altar, Genesis 8. I'm actually not going to focus as much on the Eucharist, per se, but on that which provides the space on which we experience the Eucharistic fellowship with the Lord. But before we do that, before we get to Genesis 8, we need to set the stage. The earth has just been baptized with water. If you know your Genesis, this is the flood account. In Catholic theology, baptism refers to the event which, among other things, washes away the stain of original sin. And that's what God has just done with regard to his creation, at least the earth. He's washed it. And there is a sense, too, though, that Noah and his family have participated in this creational baptism. They've been brought safely through water, as St. Peter himself puts it in chapter 3 of his first epistle. And baptism, Peter goes on to say, corresponds with this. The family unit within the church, as the church explains, is itself a little church. And that's what's just come through this baptismal experience in Genesis 8. And after the baptism in which Noah's family participates, what do we see the priest of this little church do? Do your handout. Verse 20 of chapter 8. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So let's make a few observations. Noah built Bana, an altar. It comes about as a result of a process of construction. Presumably, he uses stone and not wood, which would not withstand the actions that he's about to perform on the altar, right? So a building of stone, this altar. And on this building, he caused to go up multiple burnt offerings. I have a Hebrew there, not that that means anything to you, but it matters when we look at words that are used elsewhere. So I'm going to explain that in a minute. Ya'al, sorry, is how you'd say that. Ya'al. A different form in the text, but that's the dictionary form. On this building, Noah caused to go up multiple burnt offerings. And there's no time frame that's clarified in the text. That is, whether this was a single event in which Noah caused to go up multiple offerings, or whether the multiple offerings indicate a routine. I don't know how Moses came up in your notes. I must have been typing along and like an autofill happened, or I was really tired and I yawned and slit or something. But it's meant to say he. So he's scratching Moses out. He's not a feature in this presentation. So whether Noah himself celebrated a single event in which he caused to go up all these offerings would have taken him quite a while. Some of every clean animal and bird and so on. Or whether the multiple offerings indicate a routine that he follows over time. Offering a burnt offering on the altar multiple times over the course of the remainder of his life, perhaps, on this building. Whatever the case, the act of lifting or causing to go up a sacrificial offering represents something more ceremonious than merely setting a carcass on an altar and lighting it on fire. So again, there are those other words which you might have used to describe what Noah did, and they were not used. The causing to go up or lifting up is the image that's in front of us. It's by virtue of this ceremonious activity that more than mankind itself benefits. In fact, in the list of beneficiaries, the welfare of man and woman, as the pinnacle of God's creative activity, made in the image of God, we read in chapter 1, verse 27, blessed, commissioned to multiply and to complete the task of bringing the earth into its intended form, we read in the next verse, chapter 1. That's sandwiched between what appears to be the overarching concern in this text. Creation, broadly speaking, the whole project. For it is the ground that is mentioned first in 8:21b. I will never again curse the ground. At the front in the order of concerns. Living creatures are mentioned as an addendum to the protection extended to the ground. I also won't to the living creatures. The structure of the created order itself, then, is what gets the most detailed attention in verse 22. A couple of comments. The order God has established daily, seasonally, yearly, even with regard to temperature, cold and heat, despite its fluctuations, that order will persist. God has promised it. There is a clear sense that with regard to this altar and what takes place on it, that there is something at stake that is creation-wide in its scope. Don't mistake my emphasis. It's not that I think humans should be demoted in relation to nature. It's that this biblical presentation is coaching us to understand our own significance as creatures in the context of the whole creation. We have been created, you and I, as vice regents to serve God's larger intentions with regard to the created order. But the whole thing is his object of love and interest. And the altar takes its place and performs some function with regard to all of that. This makes all the more sense when we recall the speech offered by Noah's father, Lamech, in Genesis 5 upon Noah's birth. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief. Look at the first two characters of that three-character word there. Sorry, I should alert you. So the right character, Hebrew reads right to left. So when I say first two, I mean the right one and the middle one. They're identical to Noah's name. And there's a wordplay going on here. And Lamech is saying, out of the ground the Lord is cursed, this one will bring us relief. This one called relief will bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. So Noah is on this first altar fulfilling the mission that his father has staked out for him. What then has been achieved by the construction of this altar and the causing of something to go up from it? Well, Lamech was right. This one, Noah, comfort, has brought comfort. But how so? Clearly, in two ways. There's a vertical dimension. Whatever strain sin has produced in the relationship, whatever injury, whatever damage between God and man, that is addressed on Noah's altar. But there is also a horizontal dimension. The text's own structure and word count, as we noted, emphasizes that the significance of the activity associated with this altar is broad. It is truly good news, and not only for people, but for the whole created order. In the New Testament, two texts should arrest our attention in connection with this first altar and its achievement. The first is St. Paul in Romans 8, where he says, "The creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our souls." Nope, our bodies. The long game for Paul is the redemption and restoration of the physical world over against the discarding of it. Thus does he conclude with a corresponding hope. The redemption not merely of our souls or our identities, but of our very bodies in a renewal of the created order. This place is not on its way out in eternity. It's permanent in some sense. It's going to be restored and redeemed and perfected, glorified. And then St. Peter's description in his second epistle about Noah. God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald, keruka, of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Now, that word there, no, it doesn't mean anything to you. You see it translated herald. Who else has got a Bible open with a different translation? Any other, real quick? Oh, it's okay. Here's how it's translated in 2 other texts, also on the lips of St. Paul. It's preacher. St. Paul uses it about himself twice to Timothy. First in 1 Timothy 2:7. "For this reason," that is the testimony given at the proper time, "I, Paul, was appointed a preacher, a keruka, and an apostle." And in 2 Timothy 1:8 and 11, "Do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, for which I was appointed a preacher, and apostle, and teacher." So long before Paul uses this word about himself, Noah himself was a preacher of righteousness. But in what capacity did he preach? This is kind of an open question, but I won't foreclose on answers. Just get us thinking. Let me sum up 3 points here on 1.8. Noah, as the priest of this little church of his family, builds an altar. Letter B, by virtue of the ceremony that takes place on the altar, not only is a vertical issue resolved, but a horizontal dimension is addressed as well. The curse oppressing the created order is being lifted. And letter C, Noah himself is a herald, a preacher. But whether and how this connects with the altar he builds is only a question that remains unanswered. On the other hand, what is achieved on the altar is very good news, not only for humankind, but for the whole created order. And that's the sort of thing one might expect a preacher to preach. To number 2 in your handout. Best I can make out, those indeed are the actual ruins of Abram's first altar that remain to this day near Shechem. You can read about this in Genesis 12. Let's do the same thing we did with Noah and grab some of the backstory, though. So the first 3 verses of Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, oh, and I mean to say to you, I have an asterisk at Abram's. We're talking about Abraham, in case that's unfamiliar. His name gets changed later. Same guy. Now the Lord said to Abram, who will be Abraham later, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." I want you to look back in verse 2 toward the end, the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words, I think, in English anyway. It's a little stronger than most English translations give it credit for being. It's imperatival. It's as if God is issuing now, after his explanation, a command, a marching order. So it might read like this, if I catch all of verse 2. "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. So now that you know what I'm up to, go be a blessing." And Abram responds. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he had departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the, my italics, people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. What precisely did Abram acquire in Haran? If people, which is what most English translations do with it, we might have expected the funny-looking shapes that you see to the right. Hebrew, am. That's a natural, normal word for people. Other candidates might be enosh, man or men, or Adam. Adam's name can also stand in as a word for man or mankind. But that's not what we have in verse 5. We have a much funnier-looking word. It's pronounced ha-nefesh, the souls. So they gathered all the possessions they had gathered, and the souls which they had, and the Hebrew here is made, asa, the souls they had made in Haran. Now what do you think's going on there? Abram has been told, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. Now go be a blessing. So he goes, he preaches, and there are converts. He's made souls. We're not told exactly how, but he has apparently evangelized in Haran, and there are converts to prove it. He comes then, we come now, to his first altar, 2.4 in your notes. When they came to the land of Canaan, remember, Abram's got this mission, this evangelistic mission on the brain. He passes through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The author likes to repeat this bit about Canaanites, any chance the author gets, so as to set up the major point of tension between the bearer of the blessing and perhaps the most challenging recipient of the blessing, right? Canaan versus... So the Canaanites were in the land. Then we pick up verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And it's important to see these two sets of verses in relation. The covenantal explanation, Abram's response, and then our little package here. In the first, Abram carries on in a way, we don't know how exactly, that results in the conversion of souls in his home country before he departs to go out. Canaan is the intended destination, which we learn from verse 5 and verse 6 in the text just above. He passes through the land. Grab hold of the significance of this single statement. He is the carrier of blessing promised to all the families of the earth. He's a blessing bearer, going about as if he just emanates it. He's going through the land, perhaps just hoping to drip blessing all over the place, right? All the families of the earth. Within a created order that continues to show signs of corruption even after Noah. He sees himself, Abram does, to be fulfilling a mission of eternal significance. He's the bearer, and he's going to permeate this corrupted world with what he bears. Then the Lord appears. And for all Abram knows, this is it. The eternal has entered the present. So he builds an altar. And what is the function of this altar? If this space where the Lord has appeared is the renewal of creation within the corrupted creation, the future rushing back to meet the present, heaven on earth, then the ground must be marked accordingly. A claim has to be staked. So you build an altar out of stone. There's no preaching mentioned just yet. A sense in which Abram might, like Noah, be a herald is not quite brought out, but we'll get there. Here's Abram's second altar, the ruins anyway. Doesn't it look like the ruins of a church? I mean, you think when you hear the word altar, maybe, a 4x8 stone where you can put a carcass and burn something on it, right? No, the altar meant something much deeper, much bigger, much more significant. From there, from Shechem, Abram moved to the hill country on the east side of Beit El. Anybody know what that word means? Bethlehem, house of bread, right? Beit is house. El, in this case, Beit El, short for Elohim, which is the Hebrew for God. So this is the house of God. Beit is house and El is Elohim, God. So he moves to the hill country on the east side of a place called the house of God and pitches his tent with the house of God on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Another translational decision. Translation is such a hard job. Might say he proclaimed in the name of the Lord. So, and I don't want to go one or the other. They're not exclusive or contradictory. At the same time that one is enlisting or calling the name of the Lord to come and be present, to appear, at the same time one can be proclaiming with the other hand, come Lord, hey everybody, right? So what is the function of this altar? Because we have this new datum, this new line, he called upon the name of the Lord. One of our aims, our principal aims at Emmaus, is to teach you how in our courses to spot theologically significant markers in biblical texts. So here's your chance. I was going to ask a question, but I kind of already answered. I kind of spoiled it. What additional datum is given to us in this second installment of Abram's altar building adventures? His calling, his proclamation, right? Let's note, I guess I already did this too. Called upon the name of the Lord is not exclusive to proclaim in the name of the Lord. So the mission continues in verses 9 and 10. He journeys on, Abram does, still going toward the south, Negev. He's going down, down, down. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. I just think that's fascinating. This is the one who understands himself to be the bearer of blessing. There's strife in the land. I'll head south. It reminds me of a specific event we call Holy Saturday, when Jesus himself goes south, as it were. And what does he do? He preaches to the souls, right? Who are in death, waiting in the realm of Hades. And there's a big, long narrative that happens. We're going to skip over that. Maybe unsatisfying for you. But after he gets done down in Egypt, he comes back up. And this is 3.3 in your notes. He went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, up back into the south. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So there are all kinds of connections with what happens later in the life of Israel, right? The Exodus, where they go into Egypt and they come out very wealthy. He journeyed on from the Negev as far as Beit El, at the house of God, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Beit El and Ai. And he keeps on going to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there, Abram called upon the name of the Lord. Now, did you notice the first altar we're not told in the story that he called upon the name of the Lord. That's the second altar. And now he's thinking to himself, I don't think I actually preached a homily at that first altar. I'm going to have to go back and do a redo. So he does. He goes all the way back up to the first altar, and he calls or proclaims in the name of the Lord. There's a third altar in Genesis 13. Here's the background. Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's. At that time, never miss an opportunity, right, author? The Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and mine, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left, I'll go to the right. If you take the right, then I'll go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. It's the direction that Adam and Eve go, east of the garden. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Again, the Canaanites. This is first three observations here. Letter A. The Canaanites, and now also the Perizzites. There's an additional audience for Abram's homilies. We might anticipate, letter B, that Lot would or should go the direction that he does, he not having been endowed with the blessing to carry to all the families of the earth, right? So he's not the blessing bearer, Abram is. So maybe he should go where he's heading, to a place that appears in its present state like the garden of the Lord, that is, not especially in need of the sort of missionary evangelism that Abram has been about, not especially in need of the sort of blessing that he can administer with his ministry. This looks like the garden of the Lord, looks pretty good. The need is elsewhere. So it's fortuitous that Lot chose the place that didn't need, in one sense, Abram's missional activity. It's perhaps ironic or fitting what happens to the respective places. The direction that Abram goes becomes the promised land eventually. The direction that Lot goes, it doesn't stay in this garden Edenic state, right? It goes very badly. So that's the background to this third altar. Here's the foreground, 4.2 in your notes. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. What's missing? There's no proclamation here, or at least it's not mentioned. But given the preceding development of the altar as a place where Abram called upon the name of the Lord or proclaimed in the name of the Lord, it may be suggested that Abram's doing the same here, though it is not mentioned, is nonetheless implied. We have a fancy word for this kind of a feature. In Hebrew poetry especially, we call it ellipsis, the omitting of words, or what Robert Alter calls hidden repetition, in which usually a verb, sometimes a noun, in the first line of a poetical doublet serves double duty for an implied corresponding member in the second line. And I have some examples for you. Deuteronomy 32:7 reads like this: "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you." So the line reconstructed, or as it's implied, reads like this: "Ask your father, and he will show you. Ask your elders, and they will tell you." That verb isn't in the line, but it's implied by the structure, by this ellipsis. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib. Redone, the ox knows its owner, and the donkey knows its master's crib. You put it together in your mind when you're reading it. Or I'm skipping right to the last line in Isaiah 61:4. They shall repair the ruined cities, and then they shall repair is not repeated, but it's implied. The devastations of many generations, and so on. So this poetic feature of ellipsis can extend beyond adjacent lines of text, like it does in Proverbs and Isaiah, Deuteronomy, Psalms at times, to be deployed in adjacent narrative units within a larger story. So, we've got Abram building an altar, the first one near Shechem. Then he goes and he builds another one between the house of God and Ai. And there he proclaims in the name of the Lord. Does some more journeying southward, comes back full of wealth, and realizes, I need to go and proclaim in the name of the Lord back at the first joint. Right? So he does this. And he builds, so proclaiming in the name of the Lord as part of what it means to build an altar is clearly being presented here. So then we're told finally for a third time that he builds an altar. And I think we just rightly assume this is an altar of proclamation. That's what you do at an altar. You proclaim. That's what the altar is for. The altar as taking ground for the kingdom, this idea that an altar represents a stake being claimed, is made most explicit here in the Lord's own words in verse 17. I will give this land to you. Therefore, Abram builds an altar. The author of Hebrews, and let me elaborate just a bit more of the point I made earlier, that when the Lord appears, for Abram, it's as if the not yet has come into the already. The future has rushed to meet the present. The eternal has entered the temporal, right? The divine has broken into his human experience. And so he builds something made of stone that's got last to it. It's got permanence. And because for Abram, this is heaven on earth. This is it. And that's his perspective is corroborated by what we read from the author of Hebrews in chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, his name's been changed here, obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And we don't meet that city in Hebrews, but we meet it in the book of Revelation. This eternal city that comes down in Revelation 21 out of heaven from God and sets up its dwelling in the midst of the physical created order, a city. That's the one Abraham is looking for. And that's the one he thinks is coming out into the open every time the Lord appears. So he builds an altar. He's building the city. Altar/church, one building at a time. Understanding altar building as proclamatory, proclamational, suggests that the altar itself is not merely a means of sacrifice, but also a means of evangelization. And I think we Catholics don't think about the altar when we go into Mass that way. At least not firstly. Maybe not at all. So I have 4 final suggestions for us coming out of this little study. First off, altars ought to be made of stone, or some stone-like substance. Permanence is the name of the game. Carrying on with this point just a bit more, there's an interesting corollary to the use of stone rather than wood. It withstands the 2 agents of purification in God's economy, which are major themes throughout the scriptures: water and fire. In the flood, God washes the earth. Fire purges purgative fire, purges us, and makes us ready for heaven. But it's also a means, if you read in Peter and in Revelation, that God purges the created order as well, burns away the dross, refines the gold, right? Water and fire. And the significance of this is that the measures of purification that God uses do away with what is not divine and eternal, but stone withstands water and fire. So further corroboration to this idea that Abram thinks of himself as constructing something that will stand eternally, because it is eternity in the present, in the now. When we enter, this is number 2, when we enter a Catholic church and we see an altar, we should attribute to it the dignity of the eternal. This stakes out a sacred space, a divine reality that shows that the future glory of a renewed creation has already entered the present state of things. So let me read that again. When we enter a Catholic church and see an altar, we should attribute to it the dignity of the eternal. That altar stakes out a sacred space, a divine reality that shows that the future glory of a renewed creation has already entered the present state of things. It's already a reality in this space. Number 3, we should regard it as not merely something of value to those who are in the church and believe, you and me, but as an evangelistic testimony to those who are outside and do not believe. This is a location of proclamation. We don't just take care of sacrifices here for the assuagement and resolution of our own sin. This has a much more centrifugal, I always get that confused. Centrifugal, right? Moving outward to the center, from the center. It has that sense. It moves out. The Mass, as most of you probably know, from Missa, Latin, mission, the sending, right? The altar is the place from which we're sent. And finally, back to my title, number 4. The altar is a light to the nations. It's a monument whose function is not merely to address a problem in the vertical relationship between God and man through the lifting up of a sacrifice, a making to go up, a sacrifice, but also a problem in the horizontally viewed condition of the created order. Go out and make the outside like the inside is really the sending that happens from the altar. That's our mission as Christians, not only to participate in this life-giving sacrifice, but to proclaim what has happened to the world outside and to make the outside like it is inside. That's my presentation. We'll have 5 or 6 minutes or a little bit more, because I guess we're ahead of time. I told the guys I had 8 pages of notes. I have 2 hours of lecture material here. And I thought I had to blitz right through it or we're going to be over. So 7 minutes, yeah. No liberties. And then we'll take questions later after the third presentation.